friends, and welcome to the second episode of the Creative Slab Mug series. I think that it can be really valuable to watch how another artist approaches a project or to watch someone else's process before beginning that same project on your own. And I consider it a form of research to watch someone else consider how they're going to complete their steps, which is why for today's episode, I'm going to break down exactly how I created the project that you're going to begin very shortly. So I'm going to show you all of the steps that I took to create my creative mug, and I hope that some of these steps and my process will be helpful to you to see before you actually get started, so that you can take some of the things that I learned and apply it to your project. To begin this project, you first need to create a very in-depth version of a final draft drawing of what you're going to do so that you have a plan before you actually get started and your clay begins drying out. So I sketched mine and I didn't make it super perfect. I just went through and drew a sketchy version of what I was going to create, and I had a couple of different lists that were really important. First, I listed out all of the areas that I was going to incorporate that had to be hollow, and remember that your goal is to try to get around 3 areas that are thicker than your thumb, so protruding from the mug at least this much so that you actually have the reason to hollow it out. So I listed out the areas, which for me would be the horse's head, the back of the bum, the inside part of the tail, and the underneath portion of the hooves. Next, I listed out where I actually needed to cut into the slab. So that means that areas that were going to be joined into the center of the cylinder. So I was connecting it to the inside of the mug. And for me, that was the horse's head and the bum. So those were the only 2 areas where I was going to cut into the mug to connect it to the inside portion of my cylinder. Then I went through and listed the steps that I was going to take to complete this project, the order that I was going to do this in. And I found that to be really beneficial because there are some very important things to consider when you're beginning your mug. And it really does depend a lot on your specific design. So everyone might be a little bit different in the steps that they need to take. One of the most important things to remember as you're considering which steps you're going to do first is that when you're attaching pieces of clay to other pieces of clay, they should be pretty close to the same stage of dryness. So that means that if you're working with your cylinder and it's very plastic, which means that it's very new clay, it's sort of still very soft and pliable, then that means that all of your attachments should also be plastic and the same stage as your cylinder. However, if you're working with your attachments and it's starting to dry out a little bit and you've been doing that same attachment for a while, so it's maybe getting a little colder to touch and maybe a little stiffer and it's closer to leather hard, then that means that you should be attaching it to a cylinder that's closer to leather hard. Now keep in mind that if your project gets to be too leather hard, so closer to dried out, then it's going to be very difficult to make your score marks actually hold on to the score marks of the attachment. So the stage that you're attaching your project pieces in is very important because, like I said, if you try to attach something that's in a different stage, so attaching something that's leather hard to something that's very plastic, it will not work very well because one of those pieces is going to the plastic piece is going to kind of slump off or not be able to hold up the heaviness of something that's leather hard. So let me just walk you through the steps that I took really briefly. And with my mug, I chose to make my cylinder first because I knew that the head of my unicorn was going to be fairly heavy because of the size that I was making it. And so I decided to make my cylinder first to help it give a chance to kind of sturdy up a bit so that it wouldn't be so plastic that if I attached this, that my mug wall would just sort of collapse because of the weight from this head. So I made my cylinder first, and I did actually wrap it up in a bag because it does still dry out fairly quickly, even though it is in a bag, because the walls are so thin that it does dry pretty fast. So I chose to make my cylinder first, and then I just lightly wrapped it up while I was working on the head of my unicorn, and then I made sure that they were at the same stage when I chose to attach it. So I made the head first, and then I hollowed it out on the inside to connect those areas inside of the mug. My next step was to create the bum for my unicorn. So I created a pinch pot that had just like curved edges so that it would line up with the curve of this mug. And then I attached it and hollowed it out from the back so that it connected to the inside of the mug. Then I created my tail, which rather than hollowing it out and trying to connect it to the inside from just this skinny little bit, I actually hollowed it out from underneath so that it's not trapping any air bubbles. Then the final step was to create 4 small slab cylinders that I attached as the hooves underneath, and I decided to leave them open on the bottom rather than closing them up and needing to hollow out that space so that it would connect to the bottom of my mug. And I did that just for cleaning purposes so that when I drink out of this, I won't have to like go back in and clean on the inside of all of those hooves. So it's just like with the one open cylinder rather than like a bunch of like those 4 little divots in the bottom. So those were the basic steps that I used to create my mug. So I'm going to walk you through how I did all of those steps just so that you can see my process and hopefully learn from it before you have to come up with your own process. So let's go ahead and get started. You'll begin this project the same way that we began our texture mug, by first smoothing out a slab, cutting out the templates. Make sure you wedge up your extra pieces so they don't dry out, and then you're going to take those pieces and apply score marks to both the base, just along the edges so that you don't have more smoothing to do, and then along the very bottom of your wall. Then you'll add a layer of slip and reapply your score marks. Then you'll join your walls and your base together. The last step to making your cylinder is to take a tool and use it to help you smooth the seams together along the edge where the walls met and along the base where the walls and the base are connecting. So when you're smoothing, it's really important that you use a hand on the opposite side to help support your walls or wherever you're smoothing, because otherwise you might actually poke through that seam. So we're going to go through and smooth out all of the seams using a tool and a lot of support. To make the lip of your mug something that's easy to drink out of, we need to remove those corners both on the inside and the outside of that rectangular wall. So I took a thin loop tool and I just used it to scrape away the corner, first on the inside while supporting on the outside, and then I switched and I did the entire length of the mug to scrape away all of the corners before I worked on smoothing it out to make it rounded. This helps to keep the lip at a consistent beveled edge. Once you've made your first pass on both the inside and the outside, removing that initial corner, you're going to take your tool and just use it to very lightly drape over the top of any of those lines that might be still fairly prominent, and you do this to help it create more of a curved edge. And then finally, you're going to spray your fingers with a small amount of water, and you're going to use that to help you push down any of those edges that might still be standing out. And we're working really hard to make this nice and rounded. I chose to wrap my mug up so that it wouldn't dry out too quickly, and I took the corner of my bag and stuffed it all the way into the inside of my mug, and then I just inside outed my bag around my mug to make sure that the air wasn't trapped in the center of that cylinder. Then I pulled the excess of the bag underneath, twisted it up a couple of times, and then I took that extra part of the bag and tucked it on the inside to help support the walls. Once my cylinder was wrapped up in a bag, I was working with a solid piece of clay to create the head for my unicorn. I chopped it on the table a couple of times to get that rectangular shape, and then I used my thumbs just to smooth it out and create some details that looked a little bit more like a unicorn head. To make the neck, I continued to work with another solid piece of clay, and I tapped it on the table to get those 4 sides to help me begin shaping it. Then I compared the neck that I had created with the head that I was working on and used that to help me figure out what angles I wanted for my mug. I used my needle tool to help me cut those angles accordingly. Before I attached my head, I used a loop tool to help me remove some of those corners to make it a little bit more rounded. Then I created the section that I was attaching my head to and scored and slipped it together. I used my fingers to help me blend from where I had more clay located on the neck and blend up into the space where I didn't have as much clay on the head. So I connected it by using just my fingers and even the back of my fingernail to help me pull from the side that I had more clay over the side that had less. Then I used my loop tool to kind of remove some of those rougher marks and to also shape my animal just a little bit more. As you can see here, I use that same loop tool to kind of carve underneath the jawline to help accentuate the shape of my unicorn's face. I continued to remove clay from the top of the neck to make it look like it was tapering and getting wider as it got farther down. Finally, I sprayed my fingers with a little bit of water and worked really hard to smooth out that seam to make it look nice and blended. Once I had the basic shape of my unicorn's head put together, I decided to use the wire tool to chop it in half at that point so that I wouldn't have added a bunch of details that I would be ruining if I cut it in half to hollow it out. I also chose to cut it in half vertically the way you see here because it would be really difficult to get past the neck portion if I hollowed it out from just the base where it was going to attach to the mug. Once it was cut in half, I very carefully used a loop tool to go around and hollow out both sides. I made sure to leave an edge that was about the thickness of my pinky, maybe a little bit thinner. And as I was working, I made sure not to go too deep, especially in the areas that were a little bit farther in, like the neck, where it meets the jaw. After I checked the thickness all the way through the animal's head with a needle tool to make sure it wasn't too thin or too thick, I went through and scored and slipped it together. When I went to put my two pieces together, some of the edges dipped in a little bit more than they had originally when I had cut the piece in half. So I had to make sure that everything was aligned correctly before I started blending it too much. Once it was aligned the way that I wanted it to be, I used a tool to just go through on the outside and just blend that seam away. I did this all the way around the animal, and I tried my best to make it look as smooth as possible to help me with that smoothing step later on. Once I was finished blending the outside seam, I worked to blend the inside seam, or at least where I could reach it. After the seam was blended, I tapped it on my canvas table just to make sure that that flat edge would line up neatly with the mug. Then I spent a pretty decent amount of time just working on smoothing, so I would spray my fingers with a small amount of water and then just stroke along the edges. I also spent quite a bit of time working on the shape of the animal's head, just indenting the eye sockets with this metal ball tool. I worked really hard to define the edge of the nose. Then I used a tool to indent where I wanted the mouth to be. Once the mouth was indented, I went back through with this wooden blending tool just to kind of curve it up and around the nose so that it wouldn't just be a flat line that had been indented. So I did that along the bottom of the nose, and then I also used my fingers with a little bit of water to kind of blend down the bottom edge of his little chin. At this point, I noticed that my piece was starting to get cold to the touch, which meant that it was drying out a bit, so I made sure to continuously spray it after that point. To make the eye, I just rolled a small sphere, and then I used the wire tool to cut it in half so that I'd have two even rounded pieces with a flat edge to attach to the actual head itself. Once I decided where I wanted the eyes to attach, I went through and made marks on the piece and then scored, slipped, and blended them onto my unicorn's head. After they were secured firmly, I went through with a little bit of water on my fingers and used that to help smooth them out up against the head. To make the nostrils, I used one of those small metal ball tools, and I used it from a side angle so that it actually got a little bit of the end as well. Then I used that same tool to make an indent for the pupil of my eye, and I made them going kind of opposite directions of each other for this one because I was going for kind of a goofy look. To make the top patch of hair, I took a bunch of different, very thin, rolled out coils and I squished the ends of them together. And then I scored and slipped the whole patch of them onto the top of the head and used a blending tool to blend it into the piece to make sure that it would stay there and was nice and sturdy. To make the ears, I just took a couple pieces of clay and squished them and kind of tried to indent the front and round out the back. And I worked really hard to smooth these pieces because manipulating the clay that way did make it a little bit drier. And then I chose to cut the bottom off, and I used the first one to help me make sure that I got the angle of the second ear the exact same as the first one. Then I went through and scored both of the ears, and I used them to measure on the head and make sure that I was placing them in the correct spot before I actually scored onto the head itself. To help strengthen their connection to the head, I used a tool to go through and pull some of the clay downwards and kind of blend it into the head to make it one cohesive piece. Then I rolled more coils and squished them together and scored and slipped them onto the head and continued to blend them into that space to make sure that they would stay on and not break off since they were so fragile. I even went through and wherever there was a seam between the hair and the head, I pushed in with the tool to help connect it and make it one cohesive piece. I used those same steps to attach multiple sections of hair to the unicorn's head. Once I had added all of the details to the unicorn's head that I wanted, I applied score marks to both the back of the unicorn's head and to the mug itself. Then I went through and scored and slipped those pieces together, and when I was pushing the unicorn's head onto the mug, I made sure to use my hand as support on the back to make sure I didn't break the walls of my cylinder. Since my unicorn's head was so heavy, I decided to roll a coil and use that to press into the seam up against my mug all the way around my unicorn's head. And I did that to provide some extra support because it was so heavy. So I used that piece of clay, that coil, to just press as far in to the corner of that seam as I possibly could to help provide enough support. After pressing the coil down so that it was flat, I used just a little bit of water that I sprayed onto my fingers to help me blend it out into the cylinder and into the neck of my unicorn. And this is helping make sure that it's connected nice and solidly and that it won't fall off when it goes through the kiln. Once I had secured my unicorn's head onto the slab, I used a loop tool to scoop into the area of that wall where I knew that the neck would be hollow, so I started right in the middle. From there, I slowly continued to remove pieces until I got all the way up against the wall of the unicorn's head. This is very important to go slowly because you don't want to accidentally cut through the wall of your unicorn. So we just want to get all the way up to the corner of the detail that you're adding to your cylinder. Your goal should be to have one smooth connected piece between the center of your cylinder and your hollowed out area of your addition. To make the bum of my unicorn, I created a pinch pot, and I realized that if it had just that flat edge, that it didn't connect to the outside of my cylinder because it had a rounded edge. So I decided to just trim out a curved shape along both the top and the bottom of my pinch pot before I scored and slipped it on. When I applied my score marks and I went to attach it, I made sure to apply a lot of support on the back side of the wall while I was pushing on the front side of the wall. And that's really important because, again, we don't want to break the walls of our cylinder. Once I had secured it, I went through and blended it with a tool to make sure that it had a nice smooth transition from that rounded edge to the actual cylinder. The next step for me was to add my handle, which I was creating as the tail for this design. So I had a couple of options as far as how I was going to hollow it out. And rather than trying to connect the hollow space into the center of the mug the way that I did for both the bum and the unicorn's head, I actually hollowed it out from underneath that surface. So it wouldn't be very obvious as you were looking at it that it was hollow from underneath, but if you looked at it just at a twisted angle, you'd be able to see it. And I did that because it would be easier to wash that way. Then I used my needle tool to trace where I wanted it to go to help me know where I needed to apply my score marks when I was scoring and slipping. The final step I took to create my creative mug was to roll out a 1/4 of an inch thick slab and to use a template to create 4 individual slabs that I rolled into cylinders and scored and slipped to the bottom. And here is my end result. It took a lot of time, a lot of smoothing, scoring, and slipping, but I'm very excited to be able to use this mug. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I hope that watching me make my creative mug was helpful in you coming up with the steps to create yours. So, I'll see you next time.